Ce qui se passe dans les bois est un véritable podcast sur la criminalité. Nous discutons d'événements qui sont souvent de nature violente. La discrétion de l'auditeur est conseillée. What Happens in the Woods is a true crime podcast. We discuss events that are often violent in nature. Listener's discretion is advised.
There are flaws in the justice system that lead to thousands of people being wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't commit every year. False confessions, false statements by witnesses, evidence used incorrectly. All of these things and more contribute to the constant issue of miscarriages of justice in our society.
We've teamed up to bring these cases to light, to make it more widely known just how frequently this is happening in communities around us and how incredibly hard it is to fix this issue within the system. The cases we will be sharing are haunting reminders that justice is indeed blind, even when faced with the truth. Hi, I'm Elise from the podcast True Crime Cat Lawyer. Every other Thursday, my cat Winston and I tell stories of unsolved murders, serial killers, missing persons, and so much more from our neck of the woods, the Pacific Northwest. As someone whose brother was incarcerated for nearly 8 years, I have a special place in my heart for incarcerated individuals, particularly those who were convicted as juveniles and those who were wrongfully convicted.
And this is Jess from the podcast What Happens in the Woods. We've been fascinated with the Pacific Northwest and the never-ending supply of true crime cases since relocating here in 2018. We release on the first and third Fridays during our regular seasons and every Wednesday for our WTF series. When Elise asked Bryce and I to collaborate with her on cases of wrongful convictions, there was no way we were going to pass on the opportunity to shed light on this topic.
Together, we've created a limited series that will highlight a variety of cases that you may or may not have already heard of. Our hope is to bring them to the forefront of the true crime community and to possibly help get more information out there on these cases. You're listening to a collaboration of the podcast True Crime Cat Lawyer and What Happens in the Woods on Wrongful Convictions. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome back to the second case we will be discussing in our collaboration with True Crime Cat Lawyer. Hello, Elise.
Hello.
So this is our collaboration with her and Winston on Wrongful Convictions, a new series that we have decided that was so important that we had to tackle. We had to really get in and tackle some of these cases and talk about them. So this case that we're about to share and discuss is loaded. It is definitely a hot topic. It's a case where the nation's attention was hyper-focused on this outcome. Media outlets from everywhere were reporting hourly on, the TV showing coverage of this trial, the trials, multiple trials as they hit. Newspapers were giving this case front page coverage for weeks. There were special investigative stories released on group discussions and interviews. It was a circus. There was no let up of the just pounding of this coverage into the public, and it really had a lot of social tension, racial tension. There were very strong undercurrents that have long-lasting effects from this case. Since most recently, there have been 2 documentaries, one very recent Netflix docuseries. There was actually an opera that was done on this. I did not know that. And a mini-series on the topic of this case. And what we will be discussing today is the haunting story of the convictions of Korey Wise, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Antron McCray, and Raymond Santana. Or as you probably will recognize the names, they are known as the Central Park Five. Much like our first episode in the series, this is going to be a multiple-part episode just because there is so much information, with the background being handled by us and the legal proceedings being handled by Elise and Winston from True Crime Cat Lawyer. If you haven't listened to that episode on the Dixmoor 5 already and that victim, Katrisa Matthews, make sure you head over to where you find your podcasts and get caught up. That case, much like this one, deals with teenagers who were convicted of a horrible crime and had to grow up very quickly to navigate the justice system in just horrible circumstances. And as always, we want our listeners to use their judgment when listening to us discuss these crimes. Our case today deals with sexual assault, violence, and, as I said, racial tensions and social injustices. So please listen responsibly. Before I forget, hi, Bryce.
Hello.
You have any updates for us?
I don't have any updates.
You thought you were going to get away. I wasn't going to say hi, huh? All right. Are we ready to get started with this one?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to walk us through the events on the night of April 19th, 1989. As mentioned, there are ultimately 5 young men who were convicted in connection to a crime that took place that night in regards to one particular victim. I'm going to give you a little more of that story. We're going to go through things in a timeline. And as mentioned, these events took place on the night of April 19th, 1989 in Central Park, New York City. It was around 9 p.m. that a large group of teens, described as primarily African American and Hispanic, somewhere between 30 to 40 teens, entered Central Park North from Harlem. It's unclear, really, how the group came together or exactly what the purpose was at first. It seems likely that this was just something that, just kind of started as a few people saying, hey, let's head to the park. And as people were walking by and getting closer to the park, there may be some people that they saw along the way. And, the group may have said, hey, a bunch of us are headed to the park. Let's go. And as more and more kids joined in, it just kind of got to be this large group. And, kind of like a friend of a friend invite thing. A lot of these people maybe knew each other, maybe knew of each other, had seen each other on the streets. Not everybody was on first name basis. Not everybody really even knew each other. Some of these kids that just kind of got roped into this may not have known anybody in that group. However, this, large group amassed, things quickly turned from a group of kids going to the park to a group of kids engaging in senseless, violent acts on random people. They broke off in kind of groups, some running ahead, some holding back at a slower pace, and they were just kind of dispersing throughout the park. Not long after these teens entered the park, calls began coming into 911 dispatch in rapid succession of people reporting attacks, bicyclists, joggers. There was even a report of rocks and sticks being thrown at a taxi cab. There was just numerous reports coming in. And later on, I believe that I read that there was reports that hadn't even come in yet of other attacks that, just they didn't come in that night at that time. The first known reported attack that took place inside Central Park was at 9:05 p.m. The victim was Michael Vigna, who at the time of his attack was riding a bicycle on East Drive around 105th Street. He claimed as he rode his bike that a teenager from the group tried to swing out and throw a punch at him. He seemingly was not injured. He was able to get away to safety. No idea why the attack started. He had no idea. The next attack was just minutes later. The timeline of this is between 9:05 p.m. and 9:15 p.m. Based on other statements from other victims and witnesses, police can kind of gather that the timeline is pretty tight on that one. So Antonio Diaz was walking near 103rd Street by where it would cross East Drive, near where the other bicyclist was attacked. There was a group of teens that attacked him. The group rushed him, got him to the ground where they proceeded to kick him and beat him, took a bag that had beer and food in it, and he just was left on the ground as the group moved on. And then the timeline is solidified because the bag of empty beer was seen by the next victims on the path at 9:15 p.m. So there's 2 people that came by on a tandem bike that they were riding on that path. They encountered this group. So Jerry Malone and Patricia Dean were riding their 2-seater bike on East Drive, just around 102nd Street. They claimed the path was completely blocked by a group of young men, And when Malone realized that they weren't moving, he quickly gained speed to, gain momentum to just force them to part. They were going to break through the barricade, basically. They weren't going to stop. And as they, cleared through this group of guys, some of them moved to the side. Dean claimed that as, they were getting through, there were guys that were trying to grab her and pull her off from this group. They managed to, get away. They were able to get to a police call box, and they called in and reported the incident. From there's a little bit of a gap in time of, what police put together, about 10, 15 minutes, presumably as the group was getting further down the paths and into the park. And they turned to a popular place for joggers to run along known as the Reservoir. The first victim jogging along this section of the park has a pretty big time variance from between 9:25 to 9:40. I believe, however, initially it was reported to be 9:25, and that later on he was pressed and he said, I don't know, it could have been as late as 9:40.
Okay.
I mean, you're out in the park, you don't have, maybe you got a watch on, but if you're serious, like a lot of these people were, like the bicyclists were, competitive.
Yeah.
So they keep track of their time because they want to know what their time is so that they're getting better.
Yeah.
They want to know how many miles or, how far they can go in a certain amount of time. They're trying to, track their progress. Some people are just out walking. This guy might not have had a watch. He might not have been by anywhere where there was a clock. So he's like, yeah, I don't know. Could have been as late as.
So he wasn't training for a marathon.
He wasn't training for a marathon, I don't believe, yeah. But he was out jogging. So David Lewis was attacked and robbed during this time, but as I said, wasn't able to pinpoint a time. The next attack was tracked at 9:30 p.m. from victim Robert Garner, who he was also in that same area, the Reservoir. He was able to pinpoint his time. Another attack that was quickly made after that at 9:37 was victim David Good. One of the worst attacks that out of what I've just mentioned was the last of victim John Laughlin. Laughlin was jogging along the reservoir, having been in the park for maybe about 10 minutes. That was before a group of teenage young men came upon him and brutally beat the man with a pipe and kicked him after being down on the ground. Again, there's really no sense to any of these crimes other than teenagers just getting out of control. I mean, the one guy was robbed of his beer and his food. That's a crime of opportunity. One of the victims, and I believe it's Laughlin, had his Walkman stolen, maybe his wallet stolen. But it's mentioned in a few articles. I had a hard time solidifying that fact.
Should we explain what a Walkman is?
Yeah, right. That was very high-tech technology. Yeah. At the time in 1989, especially if you were serious into, jogging and stuff like that. Yeah. This was the precursor to the iPod or an MP3 player, which also a lot of people are going to be like, what is that? Yeah. Just think about something that played music and it was only music. And this, in this case, was something that played a cassette tape. It wasn't even a CD player. It was cassette tape. So he's hit pretty hard. He was pretty out of it, knocked unconscious, dazed, confused. By the time of these last attacks, police had responded already at the park, and they were searching the park to investigate these crimes. Laughlin was found around 9:55 p.m. wandering in a daze by officers near the path where he had been jogging before the attack. So he didn't, wander too far. He was probably knocked unconscious for a little bit. He would be taken to the hospital where he spent 2 days getting treated for the severity of his injuries. One officer who found Laughlin stated he looked like, quote, he was dunked in a bucket of blood, quote, end quote, he was so bloody. So he was obviously hit repeatedly or with enough force. I mean, your head bleeds a lot.
Yeah.
However, if you're hit in the head with a pipe, that's pretty serious.
Yes.
Yeah. So as police swarmed in, the group of teens scattered. They're hiding throughout the park. Attempts were made to flee. Police managed to take 5 young men into custody at the park that night as they tried to flee the scene, and they were arrested right outside of 102nd Street and Central Park West. In that group taken into custody and held at the Central Park precinct that night was Kevin Richardson and Raymond Santana. Both of these boys were aged 14. 14 years old.
Yeah.
A few hours later, the police were combing the park. They're searching out if there's any more of the group that remained or if there were any other victims. Unfortunately, the worst of the crimes that took place that night were still undiscovered until the body of a woman was found off of one of the main paths in a ravine. So at about 1:30 a.m., the female victim was found in very critical condition by officers near 102nd Street. She had been brutally attacked and left for dead. It was clear that most of the attack had happened in the area where she was found, as she nearly bled out at the location. But she had been initially attacked some ways away. Investigators found clear drag marks where she had been dragged off of the path. It was about 300 feet into a deep, secluded brush area where the actual, attacks were made. They suspected that the attacker had hit her on the back of her head with a tree limb, which caused her to be dazed, allowing her attacker to drag her quickly out of sight. Photographs of the scene clearly show, from what I read, 18-inch wide path and one set of footprints. And it's clear. The victim was transferred to Metropolitan Hospital in East Harlem, and she was evaluated. The reports I read list her injuries as the following, and they're extensive. So sexual assault was not made evident until she was hospitalized. Her skull had been beaten and broken so horribly that her left eye socket was fractured in 21 places. The eyeball was dislodged from it. There was an estimated total blood loss of between 75 and 80% and internal bleeding from the beatings. Along with that, she suffered severe hypothermia, brain damage, and shock. She was completely unresponsive and barely clinging to life. I'm sure Elise will expand on this, but as far as evidence gathered at the scene went, investigators knew that one person's footprints were along with the drag marks that led to where the assault happened. They also gathered evidence after being hospitalized that there was DNA from one male donor, sperm donor, found vaginally, as well as a sock at the scene. Police, I read, also found 2 samples of hair on the suspect. Working on the assumption that this attack was related to the others that evening, the presumption was that she would not survive. I mean, with 75 to 80% blood loss, it's a pretty safe assumption. And I can't fault the police in this one thing for quickly changing tactics to find whoever killed, assuming that she's not going to survive. They're looking for the person who committed this, who attempted to kill her. They're reacting to that.
Yeah.
I understand how they changed tactics from, this is a mob scene to a killing, a murder, essentially, attempted murder. So they have, just a few boys in custody at this point. They quickly began getting names of other boys who were in this group from the 5 that are in custody, and they start rounding up more boys in question to see if they can figure out who did this. Among several brought in from April 19th, April 20th, and April 21st were Stephen Lopez, who was also age 14, Antron McCrae, who's 15, Yusuf Salam, 15, Corey, or as he was going by at that time, Kerry Wise, age 16, Clarence Thomas, 14, Jermaine Robinson, 15, Antonio Montalvo, 18, and Orlando Escobar, 16. All of these young men were named as having been involved in the group that ran wild through the park that night. But something that I found very interesting is that minors age 16 and above could be questioned without parent permission in the state of New York. At least at that time. I don't know if that's changed. Elise, is that different now?
I believe so, but
Okay.
don't quote me on that.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't see. I could have done some digging, but I didn't see anything that came up contrary to that. I don't understand how it was possible at that time, though, that a person of 16 is considered able to represent themselves
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. It blows the mind, I think, because at 16 years old, you do a lot of stupid things.
Oh, yeah.
And you have no business making adult decisions for yourself in a legal manner. You just don't. So at that time, initially, Yusuf was brought in. He said he was 16. And I guess he had like a bus pass, some type of identification that stated that as well. It was later that after his mother was notified and she showed up hours later, that she clarified he's not 16, he's 15.
Oh.
So initially he was treated as an adult who could make his own decisions. However, all of these men, essentially, all of these boys were treated as men in this case. Even the 14-year-olds went hours without a family member or any legal representation in police custody being questioned. All of them did. So, as I mentioned, 2 of them were only 14 years old. Corey Wise, who was 16, stated he was not involved at all, but he only accompanied his friend Yusuf, so he wasn't alone. Something to note about Corey is that he was diagnosed and has been diagnosed with a learning disability, and he suffered from hearing loss. Yet, no parent was there with him and no lawyer was there with him to help him through the questioning. I don't know that they asked if he had a learning disability or if he felt competent to answer these questions for himself.
Or that they cared.
Exactly. Or that they cared. Because really what it boiled down to was that they were just trying to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
And some of the boys did have their parents in some shape or form. Some of them had, a family member. One had a sister, one had a grandmother present for a little while. However, the police, I'm not sure that they took into consideration that these boys had no business answering any of these questions on their own, no matter who the victim was or what happened to those victims.
Like we said previously in the previous episode, the police aren't your friends.
No.
They're there to do a job and
Unfortunately,
get a conviction.
yeah. Unfortunately, they're not. Especially when they are heated and there's pressure of now we have a sexual assault and a woman who's on death's door. And this was a large police response. There were many districts that came in and responded to this because of the location of it and because of the amount of calls that came into dispatch stating that, there's a large group of boys going through the park creating, chaos. There was a large presence. People were heated. And I believe that got the better of them in this case, especially as the district attorney, as the questioning furthers. I believe that there was a lot of mishandling in the way that they went about this. So these boys are being asked to clarify who was there at the park, who participated in the attacks, and then asked to give statements about the beating and sexual attack of the female jogging victim. Statements were made verbally as well as written over the course of hours these boys were in custody. And here's where the stories greatly vary between what the police state happened and what the suspects state happened. I've watched hours of confession tapes from multiple sources. I've watched the Netflix docuseries When They See Us, and I will reiterate, I tried to watch that before. I mentioned that in the Dixmoor 5, and Elise, I know you've watched it. I had a hard time watching it. I had a very hard time getting through it. I had a hard time watching these boys give their videotape statements. It affected me to watch it and to see all of this play out. I have watched, the news media reports from that time. I've read news articles. It is a mess. And when the police claim that these boys were questioned and treated fairly, I don't buy it. And that's my opinion. I know that there's opinions that they were treated perfectly fine and that all of this proceeded the right way and nobody's at fault. I don't buy it. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. That's my personal opinion. But what I saw was that it was not handled correctly. The boys look terrified. They look sleep deprived. They look glazed over. They look like they would have said that they had just killed their grandmothers for a Kit Kat bar just to get something to eat and get these people off their backs.
Yeah.
And again, that's my opinion. But all of them had that same glazed over, I'm tired, I'm repeating information. I'm going to tell you exactly what you want to hear just so you can shut up and leave me alone and let me go home.
That's one of the main interrogation tactics is to deprive you of sleep.
Right.
Because it makes you break down.
It totally does. And I could see that from all of them. At one point, I believe it's Corey Wise and his is handed a Pepsi can. And you could see a hand come into the video and they're like, here, take it. Like they're like shoving it. And he's like, okay, let me take it. And then he sets it down and then maybe somebody motions for him off camera. I don't know. But he's like absentmindedly, he sets the can down and then he picks it back up again a couple seconds later and he opens it and then he sets it down. He never takes a drink from it.
Yeah.
To me, he didn't ask for that. He didn't ask for that can of Pepsi. You're trying to show that you were giving him something to you're not being, you're not withholding food or drink from him. Uh-huh. And then he just sets it down and it's like it doesn't even exist. If he was thirsty and he asked for it, he would have drank it.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense that it's just a prop. So the police claimed the boys, of course, were questioned and they were treated fairly. Once they learned that Yusuf was not 16, they claimed that they stopped the interrogation. They released him to his mother. That was not, that was before hours of interrogation already. I read it. It was like 7-ish hours at this point that he had been in custody before his mom even knew where to find him.
They didn't even inform her?
None of the, I don't believe, there was, 2 parents maybe that were informed? McCrae and Santana, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the other boys sat there without anybody knowing where they were for a while, for a good while.
Yeah. And I wasn't super clear. I don't know if you found it, but it seemed like while they were there wasn't even an attempt to notify their parents to like get somebody to come sit with them to be interrogated or anything like that.
Yeah, that's what I gathered from it. It sounded like a lack of the proper procedures of when you have somebody in custody who is a minor.
Yeah.
And they knew most of these were, even according to their, 16 and over can be there unaccompanied. A good majority of these boys were under 16. So immediately they should not have been talked to. They shouldn't have been anything without a parent or legal representation there, period. Even according to that law, that procedure. So they claimed that all the boys were notified of their rights and that all the statements, verbal, written, or otherwise, were freely given in cooperation with police. And of course, all the statements that were given implicated the boys, not only in, the attacks, but more importantly in the sexual assault, because that's really all they were focused on. The female victim was not identified until 12 hours later, so sometime on the 20th of April, while the boys were being held and questioned. She was identified as 26-year-old Trisha Miley. Trisha was reported missing after failing to meet up with a friend and who was a coworker. I also read a report that it was her boyfriend. I'm not really sure which, but at least a friend, a coworker, Patrick Garrett. They were supposed to meet around 10 p.m. at her apartment on the night of the 19th after Miley got home from her usual jog in Central Park. So it was her usual routine to go for a jog from her apartment building into Central Park, and her usual time for completing this jog was about 40 minutes. So she should have been back. There was a report that she saw, a person that lived in her building about 8:55 p.m. who saw her leaving, and they had a little conversation. She left for her jog. So that she should have been back before 10 p.m. easily to meet up with Patrick Garrett. When she wasn't there and didn't answer her phone when he called her from a payphone, Garrett looked for her at work the next day, and she had still not shown up. There was no word from her. So he reported this to the police, who in turn began calling hospitals until they found her. On the night in question, she was seen, like I said, leaving 8:55. So it was also reported that she was kind of a competitor. She jogged 6 days out of the week. So she was definitely doing this and keeping track of her time.
Okay.
So she could run a steady 8-minute mile. They presumed that based on where she was found and the attack happened, that from her apartment building to where that happened, she would have been attacked around 9:15 p.m. So that's important to remember, because keep in mind, as I previously stated on the timeline, there was at least one other attack made by the group of teens. If they were connected to her attack, they were also attacking another gentleman in the park at the same time.
At the same time.
At the same time.
They're fast.
Right. So what the boys recall from the time spent with the police being questioned strongly differs from that account. They claim that they were coerced, they were threatened, they were beaten, food was withheld, sleep withheld, legal counsel and parental representation withheld, as well as told if they gave up the right statement, if they just told them the right information, they could go home.
Well, not the truth, just a statement.
Just the right statement. If you name the right names and you say the right things, you can go home.
Truth.
Just tell us.
Not truth and justice, just statement and justice. Right. Okay.
Right. But what is interesting is when you listen to the videotaped recording, of their confessions, of their statements, you can hear the assistant district attorney, are you telling me the truth? Is this the truthful statement? And they're staring into space. Yes, this is truth. Yes, yes. It doesn't convince me that what they have given as statements are correct. It also is not going to convince me, because the clearest suggestion that this is inaccurate is that the written statements, they're not consistent.
Yeah.
There are details, timeline, there is a lot that is not consistent. Also, how do you be in one place, two places at the same time? You kind of can't.
Yeah.
Right. So the time inconsistencies are as much as like 45 minutes in some of the cases.
Between the kids?
Between the kids.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of them are saying that it happened much later, which it couldn't have happened much later. We know her timeline.
Yeah.
We know the timeline of the other attacks based off calls to 911, and we know when the police got there. So police started showing up at about 9:30. And while, yes, she wasn't found until 1:30 a.m., at that point, she had lost most of her blood. That probably wouldn't have happened in a very short amount of time. Also, finding her at 1:30 a.m., if it had happened later, some of these teens were already in custody. So Kevin Richardson and Raymond Santana were in custody almost immediately from the police showing up.
Yeah.
That's at 9:30 p.m. If she was attacked at 9:15, they would have been a part of a brutal beating and sexual attack, sexual assault, and 10 minutes later been found with no blood, no evidence on them, and put in police custody after running out of the park. Doesn't make sense.
Oh.
There's also the classic, the boys all claim that they saw what happened, and while they were present at the attack, they didn't participate in the attack.
Yeah.
Antron McCray had the wrong location altogether. He stated that it happened in about a 7-block difference of location.
But it fits their narrative, or he fits their narrative.
Corey Wise stated the victim was stabbed with a knife multiple times. There were no knife wounds.
No, yeah.
There was no mention of a knife by anybody else.
Huh.
Yusef Salam did not sign a statement or give a videotape statement, but he was mentioned as an attacker by the other boys, so it was just as good. He didn't even have to give a statement. And what they took in a written statement, he didn't sign it. His mom showed up before they got him to sign it, but it was still not consistent with anything. So on April 21st, investigators began to videotape the boys for their official statements. And this was with Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Lederer. She was leading the questioning. She makes a point at the beginning of every video that is made to ask the boys if they were treated fairly up to that point. She also asked them if they were made aware of their rights, and if there's anything that they can do for them. Of course, the boys are just like, no. I mean, yes, I was given my rights. Yes, whatever. Yeah. And mind you, at this point, there was still, I think, 2 of them at this point still had not consulted with a lawyer. Huh. But, they were given all their rights and they were treated fairly. And the fact that this district attorney, felt comfortable questioning them, knowing that legal representation should have been given to them, they should have been questioned in front of their parents. Nothing should have been signed before they were able to see their parents or talk to a lawyer. Yeah. Felt very comfortable moving forward with videotaping these confessions, these statements. She starts by asking them the names of who's involved, and she wants full names. Most of the time, the boys don't know. She'll ask how they know, how do you know this boy? I've seen him on the street.
Yeah.
Or, there might have been, this is my friend, or my friend knows him, or something like that. Uh-huh. But then what I find odd is, and this is just me and it could be nothing, but when you say, what's this boy's last name? And they say, I don't know. Do you know where he lives? They're giving full ass addresses. Full addresses.
Yeah.
How do you remember the full address of somebody who you don't know? Who you don't know?
Yeah.
They might live in your building, maybe, and they might be in the floor down below you, and you see them sometimes. Do you know the exact address and apartment number of where they live and how long they've lived there? Do you know what school they go to? They may not go to your school. How do you know that? But they're able to answer it. They're able to give that information, but they may not know the last name.
Yeah.
I don't understand that. I couldn't have told you any of my friends' addresses when I was in high school. I wouldn't have known. I would have known their phone number if you'd asked me that, because you always remembered a phone number back before the phones had, contacts. But I couldn't have told you anybody's address. I might have been able to tell you the street, maybe. But all of that's what is one consistent thing through all these videos, is that these boys didn't know each other necessarily. If they knew the first name, they didn't know each other that well to know the last name, but they all knew the addresses.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just like it blows my mind, because it's like you said, I think out of all of the ones that they rounded up, literally the only 2 that had like confirmed friendships with each other were Yusuf and Corey.
Yeah.
Like those were the only 2. And like, that's the only reason Corey was even there.
Right.
Was because of Yusuf.
Right.
So yeah, maybe you know their names because like the police have been feeding them to you for the past however many hours. But I like you said, how do you know this information? Like, you've probably never met any of these boys.
Right. You're
just like you said, saying what they want you to say.
Yeah. Yeah. It made no sense to me, because I was trying to think back. Okay. I went to school with probably, there was like, I think 400 in our graduating class. And yeah, I could visualize people's faces. But even at that time in school, and I'll tell you right now, I don't remember hardly anybody's names. But even at that time, I might have been able to tell you their last name, maybe, if we had like classes together. But I could not have told you where anybody lived. I couldn't have rattled off somebody's address if asked, if pressed, if, interrogated. I could have given you directions from my house to their house, maybe if I gave them a ride home, or I could have said, yeah, I know they walk home in this direction. There's no way in hell I would have been able to say, 123 Central Park Avenue or something like that. Yeah. Never. And it wasn't even without hesitation that these boys were just rattling off these addresses. They weren't like, I think, maybe, no, it was, and where do they live? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm not buying it. I'm just not. It's not possible. And that is one of the consistent things throughout all of these videotape statements, is that I started to notice that everybody had an address, but not everybody had a last name. Some people didn't even have a name. They didn't even have a name at all that they remembered. but they could say he lives at this address.
Yeah.
How? How the hell do you know
because
that?
you don't remember that. Because I will say this, like, I can still remember phone numbers and my address, but we always had an address book.
Right.
Because you don't remember the addresses. Like, I remember sitting down and writing out invitations, to a birthday party and having to look through the address book of everyone's address. So, I mean, phone numbers are different.
Right.
But like, I couldn't tell you.
No, and I think in this case in particular, because, and I say this not as judgment against them, but the reality of it was that a lot of, I think all of these unfortunate suspects and victims in this, they're victims. They are victims. These boys are victims. They were living in the projects.
Yeah.
They were living in New York in particular, you're going to assume that people are living in apartment buildings. That's just the nature. It's a big city. Most people do not have their own, house. They might have a house that's attached to other houses, and it's not like a suburban area where there's, a house over here, a house over there, there's yard, there's parks, there's whatever. These are a lot of kids that grew up in projects and, housing communities.
Yeah.
So yes, again, they may know, that kid lived in the apartment building across the street from me or across the corridor from me, maybe even as much as they lived on this floor. I cannot imagine that everybody's going to be like, yes, they lived at this address, this apartment number. No hesitation, nothing. All of them. I can't imagine that. So it really stuck to me. That really stood out to me. And that was the first thing of how the hell how would you arrive at that information if it wasn't fed to you?
Yeah.
I don't know. And maybe I'm hung up on it too much. It's really, I don't get it. So as I mentioned, the police hyper focus on the sexual assault victim. But as we know, there are other victims in this timeline. They're really ignored. And there really aren't even questions asked about them in the statements. There are, in as much as they talk about timeline, there are some mentions of where, some of the attacks take place. But it always is in relation to how they get to the sexual assault victim. It's not really, tell me the events of the night type questioning, which I found also very strange, because if you are looking to hold these kids, these, teenagers accountable for the crimes that they committed that night, it should be for every crime. It should not be focused on just the homicide, a potential homicide, which at that point they were just operating as this is going to be a homicide. You can't assume that all of these attacks are related. New York is a big city. Central Park is kind of a dangerous place at night. I don't, I wouldn't feel comfortable going there by myself, jogging. Wouldn't matter how long I'd lived in the city or what I was comfortable with. I don't think that I would ever be comfortable to do that. To assume that all of these things are connected, you've maybe got a 50-50 chance of that, I think, in my head. Because a lot of crimes happen in that area at the same time. I don't think that's a far reach. And some of them are more violent than others. So it seemed to me that instead of trying to connect that these were all, related crimes by the same group of people, they jumped to the conclusion that they were all related crimes and that these boys were responsible because they were simply there. The line of questioning through that is kind of what I found. It seemed like they were just jumping to, well, we know you were there for these other, assaults on the bicyclists, the joggers and everything. But tell us about the sexual assault. We want the details. We want all of the details about the sexual assault. And again, as I stated, the boys look like they've just been through it. They definitely look like they are devoid of emotion at this point. They're just relaying words. They're not crying. None of them are crying. That's what I think one of the other biggest takeaways for me was nobody was upset. Nobody was visibly crying or, even hesitating when relaying this information, their statements.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. If somebody is accusing you of this type of violent crime, I don't understand how unless it was from lack of sleep, I don't understand how you could just relay this and not be upset. Because you're sleep deprived. You're at that point, the adrenaline and the self-preserving things that your body does to keep you safe, you've run out of all of that energy. You've spent it. So at this point, you're just surviving. And it's whatever I've got to say to get out of here. And that's just what they look like to me, is just devoid of any emotion. So from all of this, it emerges that the 5 boys supposedly responsible for the sexual assault and beating of Tricia Miley were Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCray, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise. These 5 were also noted to be connected to the muggings and the attacks, which in itself contradicts the timeline, but, that was overlooked. That just didn't fit the narrative. So maybe these 5 just separated from the group and they weren't involved in the other ones. But then they were involved in the other attacks, so nobody really takes the time to look at where she was attacked and where the last attack was known at 9:15. Between 9:15 and 9:25, somehow nobody's putting together that, all of her injuries and her assault only took 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It wasn't convenient to the narrative. So it wasn't addressed.
Yeah.
The takeaway was that the other boys in custody were connected to the other beatings and attacks, but presumably not the sexual assault. And some of them later on were convicted of the attacks. So something that plays heavily into this case is the public opinion that was garnered by the media. And as I mentioned, the media took this and ran with it. All of the boys' names were released by news outlets. Never mind that they were minors at the time. Mm-hmm. And as we discussed in the last episode with the Dixmoor 5, it wasn't presented in a way that stated they were charged or being held on suspicion. No, they were named. And they were named as if they were guilty and already convicted.
Yeah.
Tricia Miley, as the victim, was spared that. She was given the chance to remain anonymous. Aside from 2 mentions in small local outlets, and what I read is that was because those outlets were, hey, if the boys' names got mentioned, why does she get to remain anonymous?
Yeah.
In this case, all of them deserve to remain anonymous. None of them should have been named. None.
No.
And it's unfortunate that her name was leaked, but it also, their names should have never been brought up. Never. All the public needed to know was that suspects were in custody and there were charges being filed.
Yeah.
Shouldn't have known anything else. So, like I said, for the most part, her name was not mentioned. And it definitely was not mentioned nationally. So it was just those 2 small, local outlets that released her name. It was not nationally. So for years, her name was not mentioned. And at least we'll talk more about that in the portion of the trial and on. There's a little bit more to add to that. Another thing that I debated on bringing up, but just 2 days after the attack, a news article was released on the front page of the New York Daily News with headlines reading, quote, Central Park Horror, Wolfpack's Prey, female jogger near death after savage attack by roving gang, end quote. So in this article, the teens were compared to animals with a bloodlust-like need to just rip apart anything they came across.
Yeah.
And what I debated about mentioning was that there was also a full 1-page advertisement put in several national newspapers by none other than Donald Trump, who at the time was a real estate mogul in New York City. In this article, he paid around $85,000 to get out to the public. 12 days after the attacks, Tricia Miley started to regain consciousness, come out of her coma around day 10 after the attacks. So this is day 12 after the attacks. He called for the return of the death penalty. And basically, he crucified these young boys. He stated that, person is killed, a life should be taken in response to that. There was no, let justice take its course. Let's see what the courts, what the outcome is.
Yeah.
It's, it was preying on people's
Emotional,
just a frenzy of rally our police officers. There's so much crime in this city and we're all, exposed and we're all going to die. And I'll link the article. It's just, you overstepped your bounds. I'm sorry. You had no business putting that out there. What the hell do you have to do with this? Yeah. You have nothing to do with it. You had an opinion and you basically called for these boys who were children to be killed because of something that hadn't even been determined yet.
Yeah, they haven't even been to trial. They haven't been judged by, jury, their peers. The other thing too is like what you had mentioned was how they always call like minorities savages or thugs or gangsters. But that the media has always portrayed that, and that always hits a sore spot with me. You know what I mean? It's just like they're always called animals.
Right. Always.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Not.
Right.
Yeah, it's just like further perpetuating that narrative of, the big, angry, scary black man.
Right.
That's, out to get the white woman.
Yeah. Right.
And like, it's so dangerous to use that kind of language.
It always brings me back to when, the Native Americans were persecuted and they're always called savages. You know what I mean? They're always portrayed, even in our cartoons, they were portrayed that way, always looking at, white people and they're looking to attack the wagons. Why were they provoked that way? You know what I mean? It's just, but it was their narrative and how they've always looked at like Native Americans as savages and things like that. And what it does is it paints them as not human.
Yeah. And that's, that's exactly the point.
A way to justify, the death penalty or even harsher punishment. It sucks.
Yeah, it does. And I think what's unfortunate in this case too is there were, and like I said, I watched a lot of video coverage of this, and there were a lot of, group discussions of, the news would go out and they would gather just a group of people and they would start discussing this and get, public opinion on the case. And it really seemed to me that even doing that there was conflicting parties dividing racial lines. And even going out and doing that, you would see people of color on one side of the screen and, Caucasian people, white people on another side of the screen. And even that divided them. And it was rough to look at that because it is so still very relevant today. It's tough to look at footage from 1989 and realize that most people have not evolved from that. No. And I'm looking at video proof of it, that those opinions are still, they were alive and well then, they're still alive and well now, of, the division of, how the media goes out and portrays these things plays a direct correlation in that division. And it was very unfortunate seeing that. It made me very sad. All of this makes me very sad. But yeah, it was hard to read those things because you're right. They have those keywords, those certain things that they will put in there every time. And it's almost seen so much that you're just kind of reading over it.
Yeah.
And you don't realize how subliminal it is. And it's now that we're, a little more focused on changing that narrative, when I read it, I see it. 10 years ago, maybe I would have kind of maybe shrugged and been like, that's harsh, but I don't know that I would have processed it as I do now and been be that upset about how that was portrayed. And that was just across the board. That was one small article one day that came out in the paper. It was daily. It was national. That same narrative was just used across the board. These boys were animals. They were looking to just go out and attack savages. They were, bloodlust. There was senseless crimes. It was senseless. I don't know why they were doing it. Who knows? Yeah. Maybe it was two boys that actually led the attack, and then other people were like, oh, shit, what's going on? I don't know. What do we do? I don't know why other people join in. Why do mob mentality?
Yeah,
how does that happen?
Mob mentality.
There are a lot of unknowns to that. I don't think that at any point of anything I watched either in the investigation, in the statements, did anybody say, why were you guys out doing this? What was this? They mentioned it in When They See Us. They talked about Wildland. The one lead attorney didn't know what that was, and she kept asking everybody, what's wilding? And I was like, okay. But in the actual statements, in the actual recorded videotape statements, nobody mentions, hey, what were you guys doing? Yeah. Like, why were you beating up people riding on their bicycles? What are you trying to do? Like, who gathered all you guys? Like, what happened? Let's get to the bottom of this. Where did this really come from? I don't know. Couldn't find an explanation. Couldn't find even anybody asking to try to explain it. Yeah. It just, everybody was like, well, there they were. And then they raped somebody. Yeah. It's like, there was so much more that happened there, people. There was so much more. But this is what we're going to focus on. And we're going to make sure that somebody hangs for it, essentially. So that is the lead up to all of this. There is so much more that Elise is going to get into, and we will release that in our next episode. So that'll be next week. So please stay tuned for more. Like I said, there's a lot, and we're going to unpack it all. So as always, we want to thank everybody for tuning in. And thank you, Elise, for being with us and doing this with us. And we hope that everyone stays safe. And as always, stay out of the damn woods. We'll see you next week, guys. What Happens in the Woods is an independent podcast and is managed and produced by Gospel for the Rebels, LLC. Research and content are presented by host Jessica, with all editing and producing done by your favorite resident techie, Bryce. We believe in transparency and will always list our sources and information in our episode notes. We are always looking for new cases and stories to tell. We welcome your interaction with us on Facebook and Instagram at WHIT Podcast and at Twitter, What Happens in the Woods, INT2. Or if you prefer, our website is whathappенsinthewoods.com. The campfire is open to all. Thank you for your continued support of our podcast. If you love us and want to continue to hear us bring you episodes, please share and like us wherever you can. But the best way to help us grow is to hit all 5 stars and review us on whatever platform you get your podcast fix. Until we meet again, campers, stay safe and stay out of the damn woods.